Can you imagine yourself as a shepherd the night on the hillsides of Judea nearing Bethlehem? And all that you possess in the whole world is your staff, your tunic, your mantle, a blanket for warmth, and really that's all you have. And God has sent you forth to light a world with that single flame. Imagine yourself totally dependent on that flame. Not a building, not a pulpit, not an organization. You're without finances or advertising or backing, but you're given the greatest gift of all, the gift of the flame of life. And within your soul is placed the formula for the increase of this flame. And you're born to know that by that flame, a world can come into its own, or a world can actually recede into the vortex of fire and be consumed. I would like to have you imagine yourself among the sheep who represent the wakeful, watchful, waiting, coming to the center of the Om, following the Good Shepherd, totally dependent upon the voice that comes from within this flame, the voice that comes from within the heart. The sheep know that voice, and they come to the voice of the shepherd. They come to the place where the fire is burning to bask in the warmth of the shepherd's love. And it's a cold winter night, and so the flame of Christ descends. Now imagine yourself among the shepherds who welcomed the star of Christ's appearing. Shepherds who came, whose fiery destiny it is to be near the one who bore the flame for the redemption of all people, who would now show the people how to light their hearts to be a fire, an all-consuming fire, consuming all the other desires, and be just simply a soul on fire. Jesus came then in surroundings that were quite humble to accentuate our souls against a background not of grandeur in palaces, not in the majesty of Rome or even Greece. He came simply to be the fire in souls. Recall now that in this holy night, there were not books or teachings, but only that star to follow. And they knew it was a vibration, even as we know God as a flame in our heart or a vibration. The wise men followed the frequency of the star to the place where Jesus lay. We call God the I Am, the presence. We follow the light of our hearts. God we call the incarnate Word, the fire, the flame within us. This is the great mystery of learning. We have to exercise our souls, the flame within us, so that it will increase, it will envelop us, it will be what guides us on the journey. It will be the joy within us, the poetry of our minds, the essence of God within us, until we are centered, our lives brought forth from this. And there within us, our hearts will be joyful, and we will be nourished within us, like the shepherds and the wise men who followed the light. And then let us feel the freedom to abandon all the accoutrements of civilizations that rise and fall like Rome and Greece. For there's nothing permanent about a star that foretold his birth. But there is something permanent about that flame in our hearts. And let us be grateful that God placed that flame, that spirit within us. Please stand as you're able, and let's sing hymn number 128, The First Noel, verses 2 and 3. Please be seated. For about 25 years, I have known the story of Christmas in the Trenches. And almost all of those years, I have shared this story on Christmas Eve because I believe that it is such an important story for us to know. Because Jesus was called the Prince of Peace. And on this night, we remember the Prince of Peace and how important it is in our world to be a part of peace and peace action. So we are about to have communion, and of course during COVID, communion is different. It has been seldom that we have been able to have communion in our church this year. So Paul and I talked about how we might do it this year at Christmas, and we thought it was important enough. So we came up with the idea of cookies for Santa, and you received hopefully a packet of cookies as you came in. There will be no wine or juice tonight. Or milk. We talked about milk. We didn't know how to do that safely. And so your candles will be the other part of communion for tonight. But here in a moment, we will invite you to share your cookie with someone in your family or to partake in the cookies. But first, I want to tell you the story of Christmas in the Trenches. It's a true story, and I hope it will be true in your lives this Christmas. On Christmas Eve in 1914, In the dark, muddy trenches on the Western Front of the First World War, a very remarkable thing happened. It came to be called the Christmas Truce, and it's one of the most storied and strangest moments of the Great War, or of any war in history. A British machine gunner, Bruce Bairnsfather, later a prominent cartoonist, wrote about it in his memoirs, and like most of his fellow entrymen of the 1st Battalion of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, he was spending the holiday eve shivering in the muck, trying to keep warm. He had spent a good part of the past few months fighting the Germans, and now in part of Belgium, he was crouched in a trench that stretched just 3 feet deep by 3 feet wide. His days and nights were marked by an endless cycle of sleeplessness and fear, stale biscuits, and cigarettes too wet to light. He wrote, "Here I was in this horrible clay cavity, miles and miles from home, cold, wet, through and through, covered with mud, and there didn't seem to be the slightest chance of leaving except in an ambulance to the morgue." At about 10 p.m., he noticed a noise. I listened, he recalled, away across the field, among the dark shadows beyond. I could hear the murmur of voices. He turned to a fellow soldier in his trench and said, "Do you hear the Germans kicking up racket over there?" "Yes," came the reply. "They've been at it for some time." The Germans were singing carols, as it was Christmas Eve. And in the darkness, some of the British soldiers began to sing back. Suddenly, he recalled, we heard a confused shouting from the other side, and we all stopped to listen. Then the shout came again. The voice was from an enemy soldier, speaking in English with a strong German accent. He was saying, "Come over here." One of the British sergeants answered, "You come halfway, I come halfway." An illustration of soldiers fraternizing on Christmas Day, 1914, drawn by World War I British soldier and cartoonist Bairnsfather, showed what happened next. It stunned the world, and it made history. Enemy soldiers began to climb nervously out of their trenches and to meet in barbed wire-filled no man's land. Normally, the British and Germans communicated across no man's land with streaking bullets and occasionally gentlemanly allowances to collect the dead, unmolested bodies. But now, there were handshakes and words of kindness. The soldiers traded songs, tobacco, and wine, and joined in spontaneous holiday parties in the cold night. Bairnsfather could not believe his eyes. Here they were, the actual practical soldiers of the German army, and there was not an atom of hate on either side. It wasn't contained to just one battlefield either. Starting on Christmas Eve, small pockets of French, German, Belgian, and British troops held impromptu ceasefires across the whole Western Front, with reports of some on the Eastern Front as well. Some accounts suggest a few of these unofficial truces remain in effect for several days. For those who participated, it was surely a welcome break from the hell that they had been enduring. And when the war had begun just 6 months earlier, most soldiers figured out that it wouldn't be over quickly, and they hoped that someday they would be home with their family. Not only would the war drag on for 4 more years, it would be the bloodiest conflict ever up to that time. The Industrial Revolution had made it possible to mass produce new and devastating tools for killing, among them fleets of airplanes and guns that could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. and bad news on both sides had left soldiers with plummeting morale. By the time winter approached in 1914 and chills set in, the Western Front stretched hundreds of miles. Countless soldiers were living in misery in the trenches, while tens of thousands had already died. And then the Christmas truce came. Descriptions of the Christmas truce appeared in numerous diaries and letters of the time. One British soldier, a rifleman, wrote in a letter home to his wife, "My company happened to be in the firing line on Christmas Eve, and it was my turn to go into a ruined house and remain there on Christmas morning. And during the early part of the morning, the Germans started singing and shouting, all in good English. They shouted out, 'Are you Rifle Brigade? Have you a spare bottle? If so, we will come halfway, and you come the other half.' Later on in the day, they came toward us," he described, "and our chaps went out to meet him. I shook hands with some of them, and they gave us cigarettes and cigars. We did not fire on them that day, and everything was so quiet it seemed like a dream." Another British soldier recalled it this way, "Here we were laughing and chatting to men whom only a few hours before we were trying to kill." One German infantryman described how a British soldier set up a makeshift barber shop, charging Germans a few cigarettes each for a haircut. Other accounts describe vivid scenes of men helping enemy soldiers collect their dead, of which there were plenty. Gradually, news of the Christmas truce made it to the press. Christmas has come and gone, certainly the most extraordinary celebration of it any of us will ever experience, one soldier wrote. It showed in the Irish Times. He described a large crowd of officers and men, English and German, grouped around the dead bodies which had been gathered together and laid out in rows. The Germans, this British soldier said, were quite affable. Today, a memorial stands in England's National Memorial Arboretum commemorating the Christmas truce, and it was dedicated by Prince William. On the 100th anniversary of 2014, the English and German national soccer teams staged a friendly match in England in remembrance of the soldiers' impromptu soccer games in 1914. And England, by the way, won 1-0.
Laura, let's have a moment of silence, please, as Laura quietly finishes. Let's sit with that story for just a moment in silence. Before we do communion, I would ask that we remember all we've lost this last year. I look out there and I see the faces of our friends and our family members who are no longer with us. And I would like us to just take a few moments and remember the times that they've been in this room with us, filled with great joy. It is in remembering them that we bring them back, and we have them with us this Christmas. Let's just take a few moments, and then we'll continue with communion. Sacred silence. Merry Christmas to the great cloud of witnesses. Amen. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he gathered his friends around him, his friends who had been with him during his entire time in Jerusalem. And they were going to celebrate one last meal together. He took the bread, he blessed it, and he broke it, and he passed it around the table, and he said, "Here, take, eat. This is my body, broken for you." Then he poured a glass of wine. He blessed it, passed it and said, "Take, drink, this is my blood, shed for you." However you choose to receive those elements,